What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 180. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, joined today by Connor Freeman. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute, and we are talking about the piece he will have coming out today on Iran. So this is absolutely fresh. Is fantastic. I read it before it'll be out, but very great stuff. And so we're just going to basically be breaking down what's been happening, not only through the Biden administration, but specifically like through the month of October with the Iran nuclear deal talks and the prospect of getting back within the nuclear deal. As I mean, Biden just seems to be not making very much of an effort, and there's a pretty big treated Parsi piece on that. But before we get too much into that, let's mention, Connor, that right now at the Libertarian Institute, where we both put a lot of content out at, we have our fall fund drive going on, looking to raise some money. We're over a quarter of the way there already, and you could definitely help out. Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, Pete Quinones, a great slate of podcasts hosts, Keith Knight, Tommy Solomons, and Patrick McFarlane, and then also, great writers, including Connor, who I'm sitting here with today, but also Hunter DeRennis, Lori Calhoun, Kim Robinson, who I've interviewed before and is absolutely a great guy and really knows his libertarian stuff. I guess we're probably one of the newer kind of libertarian sites putting out content, set up like the Mises Institute, our fee or something like that. But we put out a lot as far as podcasts go. I think we probably got the market cornered on that. But even in articles and books, we put out 5 books already. New articles every day, including one by Pat this week, one by Connor here that we're talking about. So if you want to support what we're doing there at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Right now, Scott has matching funds lined up for us. And so if you donate over $100 for the next 15,000, that's going to get us a double donation. And so that would be absolutely great if you could do that. libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And then, that's where you support the show. To follow this show, you could go to YouTube, Rumble, Odysee for video version. Of course, everything's, including the show notes, are at the Institute everywhere. You can find everything to support everything. So just check that out, and I'll just send everybody to the Institute today. And then mention the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, and then the promo code to support the show and to get yourself a discount is PEACE, PEACE, and that'll get you 25% off and the show a kickback. You do have to spend $75 or more, but they have so many great products, so you get yourself at Paloma Verde. That won't be hard to do. Get yourself a few gummies. You got a little anxiety coming on, take those. More serious thing like you're trying to get to sleep, soft gels or Ed Strats are absolutely fantastic. I really like the topicals. I use the muscle cream quite often. The sports cream, it works fantastic, relieves muscle pain very quickly, lasts a long time. So whatever you got going on, there's probably something you can help yourself and just feel a little bit better at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Just use the promo code PEACE. And all right, Connor, let's get into your article and everything going on with Iran. And we'll start off with the big news we got this week, and that's from Trita Parsi at Responsible Statecraft.
Absolutely. So there is a major revelation. So Trita Trita Parsi at Responsible Statecraft got this great scoop. It's really bad news, but it's really good that it's come out now. So essentially, the talks ended in June. The indirect talks in Vienna with Iran ended around the time of the election of the current president, Ibrahim Raisi, who's widely viewed in the press and by the Americans as a hardliner, although his position on the deal has been that he is willing to re-enter not only talks, but to come back into full compliance with the deal if the U.S. lifts sanctions, which is, entirely reasonable. There's nothing so-called hard line about that. They're not trying to extract any additional concessions from the Americans. outside of the letter of the deal. And they have, the Iranian position, even from the Ayatollah, has been for the longest time since I've been covering it, and since we've been talking about it together on this show, has been that if the Americans lift sanctions, they will come back into compliance. I'm not sure if they can still do this, but obviously very quickly. But they used to say, within an hour, basically. But at this point, so at the time that the talks ended, it basically was at an impasse where the Americans were demanding that the Iranians basically, well, that a sentence be inserted into the deal that said that the Iranians promised to enter into negotiations over their ballistic missiles as well as their regional alliances. And that if they didn't, that essentially that the success of the deal long term hinged on their negotiating these what are certainly non-negotiable things as far as Iran. I mean, those are non-starters. They're not. That's their whole deterrence. And it's one of the main things. Those are the main things that are preventing a war on Iran. Like quite a few American hawks, the Israelis and the Saudis have long sought. So, they wouldn't do that, and the Americans, rather, and the Iranians were insisting they wanted a sanctions verification, a verification mechanism that guaranteed or that could verify rather that sanctions have been lifted, and also they wanted. Essentially, a commitment from the Americans that they would not leave the deal the way they did in 2018 under Trump. So, I mean, we thought that that was the impasse, and that the Americans said that, well, we can't guarantee those things because, we can't promise you that another administration won't come along and abandon the deal altogether the way Trump did in 2018, and that we can't legally tie the hands of the next administrations. But what this report shows is that in May, the Iranians put to the Americans that this is what they wanted: the sanctions lifting verification mechanism and the guarantee that they wouldn't leave the deal again. And so when the Americans told them they can't do that, they reduced their demands and said, okay, well, how about just you, Joe Biden, the Joe Biden administration? Can you guarantee us that if we return to compliance with the deal and you return to the JCPOA, because the U.S. is not in the deal, the Iranians still are, that if you return to the deal and you lift sanctions and we return to, full compliance with the deal to the letter, can you guarantee us you won't reimpose sanctions? And so the American negotiating team took that matter back to Washington and then returned to to the shock of everyone involved, saying, no, we cannot do that. And they cited legal obstacles, as he says. In fact, Trita says they offered changes to the negotiating text that fell short of a legal commitment. So, since then, Europeans, basically, Trita was interviewing European and Iranian diplomats and officials, and they made it very clear that while the U.S. tries to downplay these demands from Iran, they are, in fact, the primary sticking point for the Iranians vis-a-vis the negotiations. In fact, the chief coordinator from the EU, his name is Enrique Mora. He's the lead negotiator. Visited Tehran earlier this month, and he met with Iranian negotiators, and they brought up this issue with him 5 times in a 4-hour consultation. So the problem with all of this is, well, first of all, it's pretty obvious. I mean, that the Americans are being entirely underhanded, and basically, I think Gareth Porter was essentially reporting on this from the beginning, that the Biden administration was going to seek these kinds of concessions from the Iranians, and that they would use Trump's sanctions to do it, to use what they thought was just leverage that was, too good to pass up. But it's a huge problem, because if the Iranians return to the deal and Western companies don't believe that the Americans won't reimpose sanctions again, they're not going to invest in Iran. It's, for fear of secondary sanctions, for fear of economic penalties, for fear of throwing money down a rat hole where you can no longer, you put all this money into a business there and then it's just completely cut off because the U.S. resumes its economic war against Iran because the Iranians don't want to give up their ballistic missiles. So that is a huge problem. Also, if they return to the deal, the Iranians would give up all their leverage. At this point, they're increasing. Everybody makes a big deal out of this, although they've never sought a bomb. However, in order to bring the Americans back to the table and to disincentivize further attacks on them by the Israelis, on their civilian infrastructure, their nuclear program, murdering their nuclear scientists, etc. They have enriched uranium tetrafluoride. They've converted that into uranium metal and used that to build fuel plates for the Tehran research reactor. Enriched it, which the reactor uses 20% enriched uranium. So that was done after they murdered Fakhrizadeh last year toward the end of Trump's administration in a major escalation. And then after the talks in Vienna began in April, the Israelis, attacked their main center for building centrifuges, the Natanz uranium enrichment facility, and they, caused an explosion, resulting in power outages and damaged centrifuges. So they started enriching uranium, and both of these actions were at the request of their parliament. They started enriching uranium hexafluoride to 60%. In very small amounts. I mean, the Hawks make a huge deal out of this, and the IAEA do as well. But the fact they've quadrupled their stockpile, but they only started doing it in May, and I believe at this point they still have something like 10 kilograms, about 2.5 kilograms on average per month of this material. And really, they have no use for it other than to build leverage. So they presumably dilute it back to usable levels after they've made the point. But now it appears that, again, like I said, the Americans, it doesn't seem to be bringing them back to the table. They just keep demanding that Iran comes back to the table. So Raisi is now saying, well, we need to.
Connor, can I just cut?
Please.
I just want to expand on the point a little bit of why I think the guarantee is so important from the Iranian perspective. At least then you would know that you have 3.5-ish years for your economy to be able to thrive under the sanctions relief. And with that, there is some at least minor predictability, but there are major problems for countries that have sanctions removed and have them put back in place. So, you could imagine almost let's say in the United States, you live in a state where weed is legal, right? And then the governor just says hey, weed's legal now. And so people go out and they start growing their own weed, and they, people open dispensaries and businesses and all this stuff, right? And then 6 months later, a new leader comes, a new mayor or governor comes in and says weed's illegal and we're going to start enforcing the law again immediately. Well, even if people are able to burn and hide their pot plants before the cops get there, there's a lot of very, people who went out, invested capital, built a business that's now had they're in a worse off position now than had we never been legalized in the first place. And so, just where you had these massive fluctuations in the economy, it absolutely wrecks people and leaves them, dead when their businesses fail and they lose all their money. And, they have no hope left in life because everything just got turned upside down. And so, some of these countries, I think, feel almost it's better to live under sanctions and in isolation and, let's say, build up your medical sector within your country, because if you allow yourself to be dependent on Europe, the United States, or essentially any country that's not heavily sanctioned by the United States, so North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, Russia, Hezbollah, China, right? Unless you're getting your medicine from them, then you could be cut off at any time by the United States. And not only is that, leverage that the U.S. could use against the government, but it's going to kill hundreds, if not thousands of your people to have this happen. And of course, they estimate hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died from the sanctions, 40,000, this number is 3 years old now, but 40,000 Venezuelans died from the Trump maximum pressure campaign. I mean, these things kill. And in fact, the current U.S. envoy to Iran, Richard Nephew, brags that, the point is to make people hungry and starve. Mike Pompeo bragged about knowing that the North North Korean sanctions were working when ships of dead, starved to death North Koreans washed up in like Japan or South Korea or something like that. So, anyways, I cut in and went on a long time, Connor, but go ahead and pick up where you are in the Parsi piece.
Well, no, you're absolutely right, and that's one of the reasons why the new Iranian lead negotiator, Ali Bagheri Khani, has reversed that position and said that now a 3 or 4 year U.S. commitment is no longer sufficient. And as Trita talks about, it seems that, well, first of all, the Americans seem to feel like if they can't lengthen and so-called lengthen and strengthen the deal, then it's not worth returning to the deal, and that they would rather see it collapse as opposed to, taking on the political costs of returning to the deal only for it to fail soon thereafter, if they cannot, basically extract those concessions from the Iranians. That wouldn't look good, and that would be bad politics. At the same time, the Iranians can still sell oil to the Chinese. The Americans are working on sanctioning that and making it them no longer be able to do that, but they are still able to at this point, for the most part. So they may see the status quo as being a bit better. They just resumed their exports to Saudi Arabia. They're signing on a 20-year cooperation deal soon with Venezuela for a 20-year comprehensive agreement for economic cooperation. They have an infrastructure deal they've signed in March with China for like $400 billion, like a 25-year infrastructure deal. So there are things that they can do, like you said, with these other countries. But the problem is that Iran can only maintain the status quo, as he says, if they kind of keep the negotiations moving at a snail's pace, not quick enough to return to the deal so that the U.S. can then use the Security Council snapback mechanism and make the pressure on Iran even worse than it is now. But long enough to basically keep the status quo going. But he says that the Americans in that time may fall prey to and succumb to the pressures of the Israelis, hawkish Democrats, the UAE, etc., who are pushing, particularly the Israelis are pushing the Americans to just go ahead and launch an attack, or it seems to be like they're doing things like training for bombing Iranian nuclear facilities in a bid to pressure the U.S. as well, and talking about buying bunker buster bombs from the Americans and things like that. So.
I guess, Connor, had you asked me in March, like if the Iranians came to the table and they're like, hey, we're just looking for Biden, or not March, I guess maybe this is a little bit later, but before, this summer, the Iranians come and they say, hey, look, we just want to make sure that this thing lasts for 3 years. Can you make that guarantee? And the Biden administration thought that they would wait until a more hardline candidate came in and then they would make a deal with the more hardline candidate. I mean, I just don't see what the long-term strategy is, and it kind of just seems like this is the Biden administration not really having a firm strategy on negotiating with Iran, and they're kind of allowing Israel to make all the little decisions or influence what's happening. So should we get in and start talking about what's happening on Israel here, or is there anything else important I missed from the Parsi article?
Oh, no, that article, I think we're through with that for the most part, but I just wanted to point out there have been a few other let's see. So I did talk about Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. I'll just say that more and more American officials, including Robert Malley, the envoy for Iran, are coming out and saying that basically that they are ready to turn to other options, that they prefer to pursue diplomacy, but that they're ready to turn to other options if diplomacy fails. And this is something that Biden said back in August, and the Iranians took it as an illegal threat against their country. And again, like you said, that this is coming largely from pressure from the Israelis. Blinken just had that meeting in Washington where he was alongside Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister, and their UAE counterpart, and made similar comments, also underwriting, Israel's sabotage against Iran and attacks on their civilian infrastructure in their territory by calling it self-defense, and saying that we endorse, basically endorsing this by saying that that we're prepared to do this, and then to turn to other options, which then Lapid came out and said, we all know what that means. I just want to reiterate that they know in Tehran, and we know in Israel and in the Emirates what the Secretary of State means. So they're making it very clear that they're prepared essentially to attack. As far as what we were talking about earlier, I'll just say that yes, it does look like they are making deals now with the Venezuelans and the Saudis, and that appears to be. I think that's very good. We have been hearing, and I talk about this in my piece. I cite a couple of pieces from Responsible Statecraft by Trita Parsi and Anel Shalin, where they're talking about how is after the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, and as the U.S. increasingly pivots to Asia, which is another disaster waiting to happen. But at the same time, it's leading regional actors to start talking with each other, who in recent years have been bitter rivals and adversaries. So we see things like the Turks talking to the Emiratis and trying to build more economic cooperation between those two states. The Qataris talking with the Saudis after the 4-year blockade. The Qataris are talking with the Emiratis. And as far as Iran, we're seeing they are speaking now with the Saudis, and a lot of this is being facilitated in Baghdad. In fact, there was this major summit, which is the centerpiece of Trita's article here, where the foreign ministers of Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Turkey, in addition to the heads of state of Egypt, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, all met and began talking with each other. And as the foreign minister of Iraq said, the fact that we managed to bring rival countries together at the same table and initiate dialogue between them is not only important to them and us, but to the whole region. And Macron came out, from the French president came out and called it historic. Biden issued a little noticed congratulatory message, as Trita puts it, for hosting a, quote, groundbreaking regional summit. But they were being careful to keep kind of a hands-off approach because, as Trita argues, and I think he's totally right, actors there are basically getting signals from the Americans that they don't intend on maintaining as prominent of a footprint in the region as they have in the past. As I said, they're interpreting the Afghanistan withdrawal as anything but a one-off. The Americans have removed missile defenses from Saudi Arabia, and so they're interpreting these as signals that they're not going to have the Americans there to do their fighting for them. And so in the past, where they would have probably eschewed diplomacy in favor of just going to the American hegemon and using them as the big bully to do their dirty work for them, they're now talking with each other. And the real problem here, though, however, is that the Israelis at the same time have this concurrent strategy that Trump got rolling with the Abrahams Accords, where a lot of states like the UAE and Bahrain see it as very advantageous to make these U.S. stage-managed normalization deals with Israel that throw the Palestinians under the bus. And they can get huge arms, deals in exchange for normalizing with Israel. The UAE in their deal received, I think something like 14,000 munitions, Reaper drones, and F-35s. And so it's very advantageous for them to do that. And of course, there's a lot of corporate interest behind this as well from the military-industrial complex. And additionally, the Israelis like this because of the American policy of maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge. Whenever these states, even though they're normalizing with Israel, receive all this new weaponry, then it basically, as far as U.S. policy and as far as the U.S. is concerned, and as far as the Israelis are concerned, necessitates increased increased military aid to Israel. So Israel is now seeking these bunker buster bombs, which they've been doing since last year, using these sales to the UAE even as a justification for it. But what they're really doing is they're preparing, at least ostensibly, for an attack on Iran and their nuclear facilities. And I'll just point out that, now Robert Malley is coming out and saying things like, as I said, Biden was initially keeping a hands-off approach, which I thought was actually pretty good. But now Robert Malley is coming out and pointing out specifically that we see the Iranians are now talking with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the other GCC countries. And he says that we need to start coordinating with them and Israel to prepare for a situation where Iran doesn't return to the deal. So I think it's sometimes things are, I guess, too good to be true. I'm concerned that now that they are making a big deal about that, that the Biden administration may be trying to preempt what is at least appears to be a very positive development in the region.
Yeah. I mean, I guess so. One of the interesting things, I guess, to me, Connor, about this is you have the Arab states who seem more convinced that the U.S. must be on this track because they're doing everything, or they're not doing everything, but they are looking at and making sure there is a door open to work with Iran, where then you have Israel, who is on the complete opposite side of this and seems determined to make sure the U.S. can't leave the Middle East, because if the U.S. wants to leave the Middle East at this point, I do think that the Iran deal kind of has to, like, not really, not from like my actual, like, if I were president, just leave, like, the Iran deal doesn't have to be in place, I'll lift sanctions on Iran. But this deal does make it very easy and much more diplomatically kind of a more strategic and stable seeming position with the way geopolitics have been reported in the mainstream media and everything. So I guess, I don't know, do you see any contradictions there, or how, like, that's being squared?
Oh, well, I'll just add that we also know that Bennett made a big push. Not that I don't think Biden. It's interesting because as they pull missile defenses out of Saudi Arabia, Anel Shalim points out in her piece, which is called, for people who want to read it, it's called "Who Do They Think They Are? Israel Tells U.S. to Ease Off Saudi and Egypt Human Rights," and she talks about particularly how. As Russia and China gain more influence in the region, it becomes much more in the interest of these Arab states to make peace with Iran, because Iran has such a good relationship, a strong relationship with Moscow and Beijing. So they're incentivized to not point, whatever weapons they're buying from the Russians and the Chinese at Iran. Whereas she also points out how the Americans insist to the Israelis, hey, don't do business with the Chinese. I think even the CIA director, William Burns, has talked to the Israelis about this. But nevertheless, China recently opened their first private port in Israel. So they're not, deferring to the Americans' demands. And so she argues that the Americans shouldn't defer to, Israel's demands as far as what they do in the policy. However, we know that Bennett has told them that they insist that the Americans stay in Iraq and in Syria. Now, I don't think there was really any chance frankly, I didn't think Biden was going to pull out of Afghanistan originally, but he did tell Stars and Stripes on the campaign trail, I'm not leaving Iraq and Syria. At the time he included Afghanistan, but he said because it's complicated. But the fact is that, there's reports coming out constantly where they keep reiterating, we're not leaving Syria. We are not leaving Syria. And the Israelis are increasing their attacks on Syria as well at the same time. And it's causing more and more tensions between America and the Shiite militias. So, I mean, the whole thing is a hornet's nest. We can get into that, but yeah, it seems like there are quite a few contradictions, and that's why I'm concerned about them getting, more involved in these talks between the Arab states and Iran.
Yeah, so at the same time, you also have, I saw this today and you sent this to me, Israel holds largest ever military drill with UAE participation. And so while these states seem to be holding some, again, like kind of maybe a foot in the door kind of diplomacy with Iran, they're also more willing to and looking to step up like their coordination with other states too. So or with Israel particularly, which I guess there's no way that the UAE could be coordinating with Israel and this not being an aggressive gesture towards Iran.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that was disappointing, of course, on the heels of everything we were just talking about to see. So they're holding the Israelis are. Well, for one thing, they just approved a new budget, like $1.5 billion to prepare for an attack on Iran. This report recently came out. They're seeking, additional aircraft, surveillance drones, and munitions to strike Iran's underground nuclear facilities, and they've been talking about this for quite a while. In fact, the Americans recently tested a bunker buster bomb, a 5,000-pound bomb in Florida at, I believe, the Elgin Air Force Base, and it was the first successful testing of this new. I have an article about it here. It's called the GBU-72 Advanced 5K Penetrator Bomb. And they're saying, like in the Air Force Times, for instance, which is the article I got, they're just flat out saying, like, this could be used to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities and North Korean nuclear facilities. And they cite a guy from the Brookings Institution named Michael O'Hanlon, who says the same thing. And so I just saw a report today that says that the Israelis are seeking this same bomb. Once they incorporate it into, once the Air Force starts using it, they'd like to buy some of those as well. And the Israeli media was already interpreting these tests that were done in Florida as messages to Iran. And so on top of that, they started practicing for these attacks on Iran, after a 2-year pause. And these drills are being described as intense in Israeli media. Benny Gantz, the defense minister of Israel, defended the spending, saying it's necessary to prepare for the planned attack on Iran. And they're also looking to acquire, new planes, bombers to drop these new bunker buster bombs and to use presumably in the attack. And Jason Ditz at antiwar.com describes this. He perceives this to be a way for the Israelis to put pressure on the Americans to get even more aggressive. And what's interesting is, as we were just talking about, the Al Jazeera piece, that Israel is holding these largest ever Air Force drills that they've done. They're called the Blue Flag exercises. They do them every 2 years. These are in the Negev Desert, and they're done to synchronize different types of aircraft piloted by different countries to counter armed drones and other threats. They're using, in this case, more than 70 fighter jets and some 1,500 personnel participating. They interview in this piece, or they get quotes from Amir Lazar, the chief of Israeli Air Force operations, and he discusses how how this is the largest exercise ever. He even said this is very significant because someday the nations participating in the drill will work together to counter the Iranian threat. And the states that are involved are France, the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, who, as it says here, they're flying over Israeli territory for the first time since 1948. It's just extremely escalatory. And as you said, the Emiratis are not involved. However, their Air Force chief is visiting today, actually, to inspect the drills. So, that does, again, as I said earlier, I think we're seeing this kind of coordination where they are kind of thwarting these positive developments between Iran and the Gulf states.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So what else we got going on, Connor?
Let's see. So that's as far as Israeli escalations with Iran. I'll just point out that we're seeing more and more, in the rhetoric, they're talking more and more about Israel is getting. They're on their way to getting a nuclear bomb. And the fact is that, intrinsically the sanctions and the whole idea behind the JCPOA, it's really based on the idea that Iran is seeking a nuclear weapon, which they really never were, although that is kind of the basis all of this is predicated on. And I'll just point out that as Daniel Larison makes a great point in this piece he has at Responsible Statecraft called Note to Blinken, Israel's military option shouldn't be on our table. He talks about how the Americans, with Blinken coming out and saying that, he's in Washington with Yair Lapid, and Yair Lapid says that Israel reserves the right to act at any moment in any way. We know there are moments when nations must use force to protect the world from evil. Blinken responded by saying, time is running short to restore the nuclear deal, and Israel has the right to defend itself. We strongly support that position. And so Larison makes the point that, the Israelis have been demanding that the Democrats use this kind of rhetoric because they felt like there was kind of a rift, and that now the Americans, with Blinken saying this, have essentially endorsed any Israeli attack that comes now. That they've sort of bylined this, and they can't really control it. As he says, it identifies the U.S. with whatever the Israeli government chooses to do. So on top of being entirely underhanded with the negotiations and refusing to lift sanctions, as he says, they're giving a green light to the Israelis, who are constantly talking about how they're going to make some sort of, in the future, some overt military attack against Iran. And I found some other pieces from Daniel Larison where he's talking about how he has one called "Dressing Up Unprovoked Aggression as Plan B," where he cites a guy named Michael Singh. I don't know exactly how to pronounce the last name, but this guy was formerly sat on the National Security Council in the George W. Bush administration, and he has an article in Foreign Affairs. I thought it was just notable to quote this, that they're actually, they're saying the Biden administration should prepare for the eventuality that diplomatic and economic pressure will not be enough to deter Iran's leadership from its pursuit of nuclear weapons. Officials in Tehran have already demonstrated they are willing to permit their country to endure severe economic hardship for the sake of nuclear advancement. The United States will need to send a clear message that it is willing to go beyond sanctions and conduct a military strike as a last resort to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And it's just, it's very interesting because, Foreign Affairs, that's like that's the Council on Foreign Relations publication. So this is not like a neoconservative think tank or something. This is as mainstream as it gets as far as the foreign policy establishment. And he's just outright just making up stuff about, the Iranians, like I said, are not seeking a nuclear weapon. Israel is the one that has nuclear weapons in the region. And the idea that they're, ready to endure severe economic hardship for the sake of their nuclear advancement just flies in the face of all the facts that, they even waited a year before they started increasing, expanding their nuclear program in order to get the Americans back to the negotiation table after Trump left the deal. Again, the Europeans didn't open any businesses in Iran. They don't buy oil from Iran. Their money is still all tied up in the Europeans' banking system. And even when they asked for like goodwill gestures from the Americans to unfreeze recently like $10 billion in assets, not only the Americans refused, but the Germans came out and said, basically insisted that the Americans keep those assets frozen. So, they're willing to return entirely to this, the most intrusive and comprehensive inspections regime under the JCPOA. They used to say back at the end of the year last year, when it looked like we might be going to war with Iran, they were saying that they want to get revenge for the murder of Soleimani and for the murder of Fakhrizadeh, and we know it's coming. We have intelligence about it. We just can't show you. And there were other things like that early on in 2019, where the Bolton was coming out and saying that they're preparing for an attack. And again, same story. We have intelligence. You can't see it, but we need Trump to sign on to contingency plans for a war and all this kind of thing. And at the same time, concurrently back then, the Israelis were bombing Iran's allies in Lebanon and in Iraq as well. And this led to the attacks on American bases that led to, the protests at the Baghdad embassy and then ultimately the murder of Soleimani. But now, instead of saying like what they were saying at the end of last year, that they're planning on a revenge attack of some sort, they're just outright saying that they're seeking a nuclear bomb again. Which, again, there's no evidence, but we're in this weird situation where the Iranians increase their enrichment and they build their stockpile ultimately because they're not allowed to export their nuclear material, as you've pointed out on this show. But they build this leverage, and then the hawks just say that they're seeking a nuclear weapon, and nobody really, with power points out that that's just a lie. So it leaves the Iranians in a horrible situation. I don't envy them. I don't know exactly what I would do in this position.
Right.
So
and this is one of those places where they can't tell the truth, because if they did, then it wouldn't make sense why Iran needs to be in the nuclear deal in the first place. So if you have a nuclear deal with Iran, you like there's like an implicit thing, unless you say specifically otherwise, that the reason you have to have that is because Iran is trying to make a nuclear bomb. And if Iran doesn't want to return to that deal, then the only reason could be, forget everything else, the only thing it could be is Iran wants to make a nuclear bomb. And unless you really break down like you just did and explain otherwise, then the way the mainstream media leaves it, that propaganda point just sits.
Yeah, it's extremely dangerous, and they're even getting a lot of Iranian politicians and diplomats are saying that the when the foreign minister comes out now and says that they need a concrete sort of gesture of goodwill before they return to the table, they say this is ambiguous. There's reports coming out that they're saying that they don't understand the Iranian strategy. It doesn't make sense. You have people, their own politicians, like reformist politicians, coming out and saying, we don't think Raisi's team is equipped to deal with these experienced Western politicians. It's like, what would you do in this situation? Because actually, there's this great piece from Jim Loeb about polls being taken in Iran that show that actually the Raisi government has overwhelming support. That the Americans basically are viewed as extremely untrustworthy by the Iranian populace. They have not gained popularity since Biden came into office, and actually the statistics are pretty quite astounding. Here, let me see if I can get that article. 1 second.
Yeah, there's been a lot of great stuff at Responsible Statecraft recently on the Iran issue. Treated Parsy's always on it, but they've also had some pretty good stuff by Jim Loeb recently.
It's called
as well.
Poll: Iranians Disillusioned with Biden, Back Turned Toward East. Let's see. So this poll was conducted by it's called the Iran Poll and the University of Maryland Center for International and Security Studies, and they conducted it by phone and over the internet from August 30th to September 9th. And this is the latest of 10 polls conducted by these groups since 2014. And he talks about they surveyed about 1,001 respondents. So let's see. So he says less than half of respondents strongly or somewhat approve of the JCPOA compared to 75% in 2016. A record 27% of respondents said they strongly opposed the deal. Nearly 2/3 of respondents said it was either somewhat or very unlikely that Washington lives up to its obligations, even if it agrees to rejoin the accord. Only 1/3 said that they either somewhat or believe that they would either somewhat or very likely comply with the deal, the Americans. He points out that 27% of respondents said both Iran and the U.S. should be flexible in their negotiations and return to the deal. 52% said Iran should hold firm to its demands and rely on Washington's European allies to persuade Washington to accept them. Another 16% said that the Iranians should just not even try to restore the deal. As far as the view of Raisi, this was taken a few weeks after he was inaugurated. 78% said that they either somewhat or a very favorable opinion of Raisi. 45% of respondents have a very favorable opinion of him, which is a 50% increase in favorability since May 2017 when he was soundly defeated by Rouhani, the former president, his predecessor, the reformist, who negotiated the deal. And so it says that Raisi's, Rouhani's favorability ratings have plummeted down to like 20%, although Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister, still has 60% of respondents saying they have a favorable impression of him, who he did negotiate the deal personally. So he still retains support. Let's see, a 54% majority of the country believes that they should focus their diplomatic and trade relationships with Asian countries, including Russia, China, and India, as opposed to Germany, France, and the UK. And they have a very favorable impression of China, 57%, which is up from last year where it fell to less than 40 after COVID hit Iran so badly. I think about 125,000 people died from COVID in Iran. the Americans maintain sanctions. And I believe Raisi actually just said to the UN recently that American sanctions during the COVID pandemic amounted to crimes against humanity, which is hard to argue against that. But the favorability rating of China has increased since then. 85% of respondents said they had an either somewhat or very unfavorable opinion of the Americans. The only country that they were asked to rate that fared worse was Saudi Arabia. About 76% of respondents said they have a very unfavorable view of the Americans. And I'll just say that he points out that as far as Biden's policies, they asked them to rate policies. They asked the Iranians to rate Biden's policies toward Iran on a scale of 0, which would be completely hostile, to 10, which would be completely friendly. And 67% gave a score of in the 0 to 4 range. Only about half expected Biden's policies to be hostile toward Iran back in February. More than 40% now give Biden a 0 or a 1 on that scale, which is an increase of about 10% since February. And then the last thing I'll just say about the Israeli attacks, 66% of respondents feel that they believe Washington had prior knowledge of the recent explosions at the Natanz nuclear facility, and 85% said they believed that the Americans had prior knowledge of the assassination of Iran's nuclear scientists. And then the last thing, they just point out that is even though the economy is quite poor in Iran, the Iranians maintain they have a lot of confidence in their basic institutions of government, in the police, the military, the judiciary, the president, the parliament. It's like a 70 to 80%. Let's see, a majority of Iranians, like 54%, think they'll be living better in 3 years from now, and 70 to 80% have either some or a great deal of trust in the basic institutions of their society, and they mostly blame the economy on American sanctions and COVID. So the American policy, even if it's supposed to, the sick sort of twisted logic behind American sanctions and economic warfare against these countries is to turn the people against the targeted regime. Well, this is very clearly showing that the opposite effect is what's actually taking place. And again, it's just I don't know exactly where. They also, before I forget, 7 out of 10 respondents defended Iran's advanced ballistic missile program, and another 20% said it was somewhat important. So, 90% of the population supports those ballistic missiles. There's no way, even before I knew those facts, everybody knew that Iran was not going to negotiate those ever, even if the Americans and the Israelis want them to. But it would be, even only from a domestic political standpoint, a disaster to put that on the table. So, yeah, it's just like I said, I don't know exactly where we're going from here, especially since this Treaty of Parsi piece came out. It appears that the Americans have really created a situation where I don't see it going anywhere good from here. Although hopefully the Europeans, some of the regional countries, and the Russians and the Chinese can do something to insist on a honest negotiation where the Americans just agree to return to the letter and commit themselves to the JCPOA. Otherwise, I don't know exactly how we get out of this.
Yeah, this seems like the Biden administration has put itself in a real mess. So before I get your final thoughts, Connor, there is one kind of last thing, recent news that I want to hit on. That is some alleged strikes going on in Syria, where Syria is a place where it's basically been like an international battlefield where the poor Syrians have just been the victims of it time and time again, whether it was like the U.S. versus Russia and China, or Israel versus Iran, or the U.S. versus Iran. All that's been playing out, and so the U.S. is alleging that Iran is carrying out strikes against U.S. bases in Syria, which of course my question is, what the hell are those bases doing there in the first place? But also Israel is carrying out drone strikes in Syria, and so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on this because these things happen. We've covered them time and time again. The significance is that when Israel or the U.S. target Iranian backed groups or, Shia militias or Assad's forces in Syria, it is a blow against the Iranian effort there, and it is seen by Iran as, an attack against like them or their allies. And then also we see when there's any kind of retaliation against either Israel or U.S. forces, occupation forces in Syria that are taking up a good chunk of that country. Anytime there's retaliation, well, then this is like Iranian bad terrorism, and when there's Iranian bad terrorism, you can't have diplomacy with Iran, and so this seems to be a real problem for the JCPOA. So maybe just break this down, especially within the context of the JCPOA.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so of course, the way it's framed is, of course, let's start with the accusations. So the article that just came out from the AP, they're talking about. So they say U.S. officials say they believe Iran was behind the drone attack last week at a military outpost in southern Syria. This is the Al-Tanf outpost, the Al-Tanf base where American troops are based. So it's just interesting the way it's worded. They say the U.S. believes that Iran resourced and encouraged the attack, but that the drones were not launched from Iran. They were Iranian drones, and Iran appears to have facilitated their use, officials said, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss details that have not yet been made public, or that have not been made public. So they say that they believe the attacks involved as many as 5 drones laden with explosive charges that hit both the U.S. side of the Al-Tanf garrison as well as the side where the Syrian opposition forces stay. And they say that there were no reported injuries or deaths. They talk about U.S. and coalition troops are based at Al-Tanf to train Syrian forces on patrols to counter the Islamic State. The base is also located on a road serving as a vital link for Iranian-backed forces from Tehran all the way to southern Lebanon and Israel. So again, they're being somewhat honest about it. The concern here is not really the Islamic State, who are really just a vastly diminished threat at this point. They essentially exist basically in small pockets in the desert in Syria. They're not really much of a threat anymore. The real idea is to check Iran, which the Hawks will occasionally admit in their publications that is the real intention of all this. So Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, John Kirby, came out and was asked about these reports. He called it a complex, coordinated, and deliberate attack, but declined to provide details when asked to go further. He did not go into specifics, and he had no update on the munitions used in the attack. In fact, he said the protection and security of our troops overseas remains a paramount concern for the secretary, referring to Lloyd Austin, Pentagon chief. If there is to be a response, it will be at a time and place and a manner of our choosing. Now, that's interesting because the Americans are that's an illegal presence in Syria. It's not covered by any AUMF. It's obviously unconstitutional, a violation of Article 1, Section 8. They're illegally occupying a country in contravention of international law. The country is also under sanctions. According to the UN, something like 12.4 million people in Syria are close to starvation as a result of the Caesar Act sanctions, which target construction and energy. The Blinken came out recently, it might have been last week or the week before, and said that it was at that meeting I was discussing earlier in Washington with Yair Lapid, where he said our position is to prevent reconstruction, and we will actively discourage any normalization, because Jordan recently opened their border with Syria. We'll discourage any sort of normalization towards Syria, will not lift a single sanction until there is an irreversible, what they call, political solution. And I think he basically said, he might have phrased it slightly differently, but they want regime change to this day. They want to get rid of Assad in Damascus. In this piece, they go, pro-Iran media outlets have been saying that the attack was carried out by Syria's allies. They quote, I love this. It says, according to an official with the so-called Axis of Resistance, an anti-Western political military alliance. I don't know if I'd describe them as anti-Western. Their primary enemies are Al-Qaeda, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States. It's not really the West. You're attacking ISIS. I don't know if I'd call that an anti-Western alliance. I suppose if you're looking at them as proxies of the West, you could make that argument, but it's not what they're doing here. And so they just say that, and they don't cite whatever publication they're talking about. So not that I don't think the Shiite militias carried out this attack. They have all the motivation to do so and all the motive. They keep getting attacked. This was potentially in response to, Israel is at this point attacking Syria, not just on a weekly basis, but multiple times per week. They attacked Palmyra, I believe, twice in the week leading up to this attack on the Al-Tanf base. And the F-16s were seen coming over. Let's see. So there's a article from Jason here, from Jason Ditz, who says that militias threaten response after Israel kills 9 in a strike on Syria. So if we rewind the tape a bit really quick here, on October 15th at antiwar.com, Jason was reporting that the attacks came through Jordanian airspace over a U.S. base, and that was the Al-Tanf base that we were just talking about. So as he said, it could lead to claims of U.S. and Jordanian responsibility. The militias could hit either of them over the incident. The militias immediately reacted angrily, promising to respond forcefully to the attack. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights was reporting that 9 pro-government fighters were killed in the attack, the Israeli attack near Palmyra, 5 of which were of an undetermined nationality. Now, there was another report about how Israel used civilian airliners as cover in this attack. So in order to basically ensure that the air defenses, which Russia in the recent past, was actually expressing and some discontent and complaining about. They were discontent and complaining about these constant Israeli attacks in Syria. So they were trying to discourage them and bolstering their air defenses. And in fact, it led to Israel, I believe, not attacking Syria in a very unusual instance. They didn't attack them, I believe, for like 27 days or maybe close to a month. But they've since resumed the attacks, and I'll get to that again in a second. But they used a civilian airliner as cover, because they figured that the air defenses wouldn't be activated and risk an embarrassing shoot down of a civilian airline like that. In 2018, Jason cites an incident where the Israelis did this with a Russian spy plane that was actually shot down by the Syrians that killed 15 crew members. Russia blamed Israel for the whole thing, but nevertheless, the Syrians, I guess in this case, would preferred to take the hit than to risk anything like that happening again. And as he says, and Jason's totally right, it shows Israel's disregard for civilian safety so long as they can attack these targets with impunity. But speaking of that, we now have reports that Russia plans to allow Israel to attack Syria with impunity. So as I said, they previously said that they were unhappy with this and were trying to discourage these attacks. But now Israel's housing minister has reported that they've come to an understanding with Putin that a deconfliction mechanism will remain in place and that Israel can now strike Syria without any response. Not that there was really any response before, frankly. I don't think there was really much Russia could have done. But at this point now they're saying just have at it. Just go ahead and do whatever you want. Since then, I mean, it seems like the only conditions Russia really has is that that Israel keeps their warplanes away from Russian bases, and that's probably still ongoing. That's probably still in place. They may still be, like I said, helping the Syrians with their air defenses. But since then, we just got the report last night that Israeli drones attacked 2 sites in southern Syria, in Kintera near the Golan Heights, where they attacked what's purported to be a Hezbollah base, and a second site that was a Syrian army reconnaissance tower, again near the Golan Heights. So no information on any casualties, but the Syrian Foreign Ministry described it as a new aggression. So expect to hear more attacks from the Israelis on Syria. And just as you said, when the Americans come out and blame Iran for this, is becoming routine, because back when this happened previously, I think for the second time in June, when Americans, I believe it was June, when the Americans bombed Iraqi militias again in Syria, Biden was sitting in the Oval Office with the Israeli president and boasted about how this is our message to Iran. So again, and the way it's being reported in the AP as we described, it's just framing as more Iranian attacks. But as we see, the Shiite militias have their own nationalistic reasons and motives for attacking the Americans when they're under sanctions and they're being attacked constantly by Israel, and the Americans still, periodically bomb the country and occupy their oil fields and their wheat fields, and they have every reason to be doing this. And the Iraqi militias have the same beef with the American occupation forces still in their country. After Soleimani was killed, the Iraqi parliament voted unanimously to kick the Americans out, and they still haven't left, and there's no plan to. So to describe this as, Iranian aggression or anything like that is just entirely disingenuous. It would be as ridiculous as blaming Hamas retaliation against Israeli attacks on Gaza on Iran, which the hawks here do all the time. So it's just par for the course. But it's completely absolving Israel of any and all, and the Americans of any and all responsibility for any sort of attacks on their own people or their own forces. Which it's ridiculous to say that Austin cares about the troops' safety. He's putting them in harm's way, and they never said anything about intentions to pull them out. So it's absolutely ridiculous, and it should be clear to everybody that that's exactly what it is. And again, I don't think it bodes well for the JCPOA, long story short, because they're just going to use this as an excuse again to refuse to do the right thing.
All right, Connor, that's where we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. Everybody check out the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/donate to help us with our fall fund drive right now, matching donations. So if you donate over $100, somebody will match that for you, and it's like a double donation. So make your $100, $200, or whatever you want to do. We really appreciate for people who could contribute. Scott does offer kit bats, like different of his books, signed copies, all that great stuff. Ron Paul Copper Coin. So you could get that at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Connor, thanks for coming back on the show. You're on Twitter at Freeman's Mind 96.
You got it. And thank you as always, Kyle. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody.